Somewhere between the tariff orders, the press conferences, and the speeches about sovereignty, something quietly broke. Not a treaty, not a talking point, not even a trade schedule. Something deeper than that. The assumption broke. The assumption that Washington could hit Canada hard and publicly and watch Ottawa fold on command. The assumption that the larger economy automatically controls the emotional temperature in the room. The assumption that pressure repeated often enough always produces submission. And the moment that assumption cracked, the story changed. What you are watching is not just another ugly week in North American trade. It is a test of what power looks like when one side has size and the other side has strategic weight. And if you think those are the same thing, stay with me, because they are not. One can dominate a headline, the other can quietly shape the outcome. Look at the sequence. President Trump moved ahead with tariffs on Canada. The White House framed those duties as a national security response tied to fentanyl, trafficking, and border failures. Then the pressure widened beyond the tariff itself. More threats, more rhetoric, more suggestions that Canada could simply be forced into a better deal from Washington's point of view. That is the verified version of the attack the title and thumbnail are reaching for. Not tanks, not warplanes, economic force, public intimidation, and repeated escalation from the top of the U.S. government. And here is the question the original script wanted to ask, but without the exaggeration. When was the last time a country that supposedly held all the leverage felt the need to keep saying it out loud? Because real dominance usually does not need that much narration. Real dominance does not keep tapping the microphone to remind the room who is in charge. So tell me in the comments as you watch this. When a superpower keeps repeating its power, is that strength or is it the first sign that the other side is not moving? To understand what is real here, you have to fix the timeline. On February 1st, 2025, Trump ordered new tariffs on Canadian imports, and Reuters reported that then Prime Minister Justin Trudeau answered with 25% tariffs on C$155 billion of U.S. goods. On March 3rd, the White House formally said the U.S. was proceeding with tariffs on Canada and Mexico. On March 13th, Canada put 25% retaliatory tariffs into effect on a list of U.S. goods tied to the steel and aluminum fight, covering $29.8 billion in products. That is the verified pressure campaign. Not rumor, not unnamed insiders. Public action on the record with official documents behind it. Now here is the part the competitor's script got wrong in a way that matters. Mark Carney was not Prime Minister on February 10th. He won the Liberal leadership on March 9th and was sworn in on March 14th. So the dramatic story beat about Carney calmly absorbing the first wave of tariff fire in early February simply does not hold up. But that does not mean the larger emotional beat is false. It means the real version begins later and is cleaner. Carney entered office after the tariff conflict was already burning, and from the start he projected control, not panic. By March 27th, Carney was standing at a press conference saying Canada would fight U.S. tariffs with retaliatory trade actions designed for maximum impact in the United States and minimum impacts in Canada. He said nothing was off the table. He said the old relationship had fundamentally changed. That is not theatrical language. That is a signal, and it is much stronger because it was actually said publicly on camera with Reuters and everyone else listening. This is where the story gets interesting. Carney's first overseas trip as Prime Minister was not to Washington. It was to Paris and London. Reuters reported that he used that visit to talk about strengthening ties with reliable allies. And in Paris, he explicitly pitched Canada as a trustworthy partner to France and Europe at a moment of rising tension with the United States. That is not symbolism by accident. That is a message aimed at three audiences at once: Washington, Canadian voters, and every allied capital looking for a stable democratic supplier in a more volatile world. And this is the verified version of Carney strikes back with confidence. Not by screaming, not by feeding the outrage machine, by moving first, speaking carefully, and changing the frame. When Trump later threatened bigger tariffs if Canada and the EU worked together, Carney's public answer was, "I take note of the president's comment. I don't take direction from it. That is the line. That is the mood. That is the posture the original script was reaching for." So yes, Washington went loud. Ottawa went quiet, but do not mistake quiet for passive. Quiet can be strategic. Quiet can be disciplined. Quiet can be what a government sounds like when it is no longer trying to win the morning headline and is instead trying to build a different map of options before the next round begins. Now let me show you the iceberg. The U.S. Canada relationship is not just about speeches and tariffs. It is built into physical systems. Energy is the clearest example. The U.S. Energy Information Administration says 60% of U.S. crude oil imports came from Canada in 2023, and Canada's crude amounted to 24% of total. U.S. refinery throughput. Many U.S. refineries were designed to process heavier oil like the grades Canada produces. That matters because supply chains like that do not pivot in a weekend. They do not care about the emotional temperature of a campaign speech. They care about pipelines, refinery chemistry, and infrastructure that took decades to build. The second layer is minerals. Canada's own critical minerals strategy is explicit. It wants to become the world's green supplier of choice, and it prioritizes lithium, graphite, nickel, cobalt, copper, and rare earth elements. The document also underscores how tightly Canada is tied into North American manufacturing, especially through Ontario's auto ecosystem. In other words, this is not just a country sitting next to the U.S., it is a country embedded inside the supply chains Washington says it wants to secure. And then there is water. Canada's government says the country holds 20% of the world's freshwater reserves and nearly 7% of the world's annually renewable water. No, fresh water is not sitting inside today's tariff lists, but it matters strategically because it reminds you that Canada is not some disposable side market. It is a resource state, an industrial partner, and a geographic anchor. So when anyone says the United States simply does not need Canada, put that sentence next to the actual map. The map is more honest. Let us look at the receipts. Reuters reported on February 1st that U.S. consumers were likely to see higher prices at the gas pump if tariffs hit Canadian oil, because the U.S. imports about 4 million barrels per day from Canada and roughly 70% of that is processed by Midwest refiners. Analysts told Reuters those higher costs would flow through two finished fuels. That is not ideology, that is mechanics. Then on March 4th, Reuters reported in Bridges' CEO saying tariffs would need to be in place for years before they seriously changed U.S. Canada crude flows because there is no easy substitute for those barrels. Read that again. No easy substitute. That one phrase tears a hole in the fantasy that this relationship can be reset overnight, without pain showing up somewhere downstream. And the auto side is just as revealing. Reuters reported on March 26 that the new 25% auto tariffs could add thousands of dollars to vehicle costs, disrupt nearly all North American production, and threaten jobs across the region because the manufacturing system is so deeply intertwined across Canada, Mexico, and the United States. On March 3rd, Reuters also reported Wall Street tumbling after Trump said the Canada and Mexico tariffs were coming. The S&P 500, NASDAQ, and Dow all fell sharply. So when people say this was a clean show of American leverage, ask them why the market reacted like a warning siren. This is the boomerang. This is what the original script was trying to capture with all the dramatic language about backfire. The verified version is simpler and stronger. Integrated systems punish reckless pressure, especially when the target is also a supplier, a buyer, and a manufacturing partner rolled into one. Now we get to the real counterpunch. Carney's move was not to pretend Canada could shrug this off. It was to turn the pressure into political permission. Permission to tell Canadians the U.S. relationship had changed. Permission to deepen links with Europe. Permission to talk openly about trade diversification, infrastructure, and a less dependent economy. Reuters reported on March 28 that Carney said Canada and the U.S. would begin talks on a new economic and security relationship after the election, even as Ottawa prepared counter tariffs and proposed a $5 billion trade diversification fund. That is not surrender. That is using the hit to justify the rebuild. So if you want the truthful version of the thumbnail promise, here it is. Carney did strike back with confidence. He just did it in the language of statecraft, not the language of YouTube rage bait. His retaliation was measured. His messaging was disciplined. His international signaling was deliberate. And that difference matters because the entire conflict is partly about who can stay composed while the economic consequences spread. This is why every new escalation from Washington can also work as a gift to Ottawa. Not because pain is good, it is not, but because every escalation makes Carney's argument easier to sell. That Canada needs more room, more partners, and less exposure to a single capital that has become comfortable using economic dependence as a weapon. If you live in Canada, the short-term picture is still hard. Retaliation is not cost-free. Export uncertainty is real. Cross-border manufacturing friction is real. Investment hesitation is real. Trudeau said Americans would feel pain from tariffs, but Canadians would too. Carney later warned of tough times ahead and said the old U.S. Canada relationship had fundamentally changed. That means households, factories, logistics firms, and provincial governments all have to think in a more defensive posture than they did before. But the longer-term question is different. If Ottawa can use this moment to diversify trade routes, upgrade ports and rail, attract new capital, and reduce single market dependence, then the political pain of the moment could become strategic insulation later. That is the wager behind Carney's posture. Not that tariffs do not hurt. They do, but that dependence hurts more when the other side decides to weaponize it. And that is where the emotional center of this story really sits. For Canadians, this is no longer just about winning one round. It is about whether this country emerges from the shock smaller, angrier, and more exposed, or more self-aware, more diversified, and harder to corner the next time a White House decides pressure is policy. If you live in the United States, you are not watching a foreign drama. You are inside the blast radius. Reuters reporting on oil made that plain. Higher refinery costs translate into higher fuel costs. Reuters reporting on autos made the next step plain too. Tariffs on an integrated North American vehicle system translate into higher sticker prices, disrupted production, and pressure on jobs. This is not something that stays in press rooms and cabinet meetings. It moves through freight, energy, and manufacturing until it lands in ordinary budgets. And that is the part political rhetoric always tries to outrun. It is easy to sell tariffs as toughness. It is much harder to explain why fuel gets pricier, why vehicles cost more, why markets wobble, and why industries built around cross-border flows start warning about chaos. On March 3rd, Wall Street did not react like it was looking. At a tidy negotiating masterstroke, it reacted like it was staring at uncertainty with real earnings risk attached. So no, the average American is not a spectator here. If the U.S. wants to treat Canada like a pressure point, it also has to accept that Canada's its inside systems Americans use every week at the pump, at the dealership, in factories, and across the industrial Midwest. That is the hidden reciprocity beneath the shouting. The first scenario is the least disruptive. After the election cycle and the next negotiation window, Washington and Ottawa narrow the tariffs, quiet the rhetoric, and reach some form of managed accommodation. Neither side gets everything. Both sides declare some version of victory. The temperature comes down, even if the trust never fully returns. That path is possible because Reuters reported both Trump and Carney describing their March 28th call as productive and agreeing to broader talks after the election. The second scenario is the most damaging. The tariffs harden. The auto fight expands. Canada accelerates its search for alternative markets and trusted allies. North American supply chains begin to reroute not because anyone designed a beautiful new system, but because the old one became politically dangerous once industry starts. Redesigning around political risk, the cost of putting the old map back together gets much higher. The third scenario is the one I think looks most like reality. Public strength, private bargaining, periodic flare-ups, partial deals, more retaliation, then another pause. In other words, a relationship that remains too economically entangled for a clean break and too politically damaged for a clean reset. The rhetoric says rupture. The pipelines, factories, and freight corridors say not so fast. So here is the question I want to leave you with. We have spent generations assuming the biggest economy in the room automatically writes the terms for everyone else. But what happens when the room contains a neighbor that your refineries rely on, your factories are integrated with, your mineral strategy overlaps with, and your market cannot easily replace? What happens when size is still real, but dependence is real too? Because that is what makes this story bigger than one tariff cycle. The louder Washington gets, the more it may reveal what it cannot quickly replace. And the quieter Ottawa stays, the more it may reveal that leverage is not always held by the country making the most noise. Sometimes it sits with the country that understands the map, the infrastructure, and the timing better than everyone watching the headlines. So I will leave you with the same kind of question the original script was chasing, just cleaned up and verified. When the loudest voice in the room keeps announcing its power, and the quieter side keeps building alternatives, which side is actually more confident? And which side is more afraid of the next round?